Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. What, according to the 2010 investment statement of the Government of New Zealand, was the average total shareholder return over the last 5 years from SOEs and the average bond rate? And is that consistent with his statement that, quote, it's the government's intention to use the proceeds of those initial public offerings to actually invest in other assets that the government would have to fund through the government bond rate?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the average total shareholder return for the Crown's commercial portfolio over the last 5 years was 17.5%. But most of the total return was from unrealised changes. The Treasury advises that these calculations are robust are in fact potentially misleading. Average net dividends over the 5 years were only 4.6%. The average bond rate was 6%. And to the last part of the member's question, yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, if the average return from the SOEs to the shareholder is 17% and the cost of raising money through bonds is 6%, how is the taxpayer the winner from selling off the SOEs instead of raising money through bonds?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it's the total average return, 17.5%, not the average return, which is probably why the Leader of the Opposition wants the government to resign to have a snap election, because he's confused between our polling numbers and their polling numbers, actually.
The Honourable...
point of order, Mr
Point
Speaker.
of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I think you've made the point in the past that superfluous comments at the end of the Prime Minister's statements are straightforward questions.
Order. I apologise to the member, but senior members should not interject during a point of order. And the Honourable Leader of the Opposition hadn't finished his point of order.
The point of order was quite clear, Mr Speaker. You've in the past ruled that those sort of comments at the end of an answer to a straight question are not in order.
I think the member makes a reasonable point that his question was not an unfair question and didn't deserve quite the answer. I think the Right Honourable Prime Minister should come back to the question, actually answer the... Well, if there's debate about it, I invite the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to repeat his question. Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, how does the government and therefore the New Zealand taxpayer benefit when the return from the SOEs is around 17% and the bond rate is 6%?
Point of order, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Sorry, that wasn't the question that the member asked the first time.
Order. Order. Now I say to the Labor front bench that a point of order was being heard and they will not interject. It seemed to me to closely approximate if it wasn't, because the question the Leader of the Opposition asked was to do with how the taxpayer benefited when the total, whatever it is, return from SOEs was 17.5% and the bond rate 6%. And that was the part that there's plenty of answers I can think of to that are available to the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister didn't use any of what could be reasonable answers to that. And I think the question didn't attack the government politically. It asked a reasonable question, and I think it deserves a reasonable answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Point of order, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, if I could paraphrase for the member, the question that he asked was the total, this claim he made was the total average return was 17.5%. It was that he didn't say total, he said the average return was 17.5%. Mr Speaker, that is totally different and completely incorrect, and if you can't work that out, then obviously deserves a stupid answer.
Order. Member will resume his seat. Now, the Prime Minister should know that's not going to help the good order of the House to make that kind of comment during a point of order. And I hear the point the member's making, and that's why I invited the Leader of the Opposition to repeat his question so that what he intended could be asked. And I accept the point that the Right Honourable Prime Minister makes that the member may not have asked exactly what he intended first time round. That's why I'm inviting him to repeat his question. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Well, I've invited his leader to repeat. Order.
Yes, I know, sir, and I'm making this point with the approval of my leader, The mistake that was made was that the Prime Minister misinterpreted Mr Goff's question.
Order. The member will resume his seat immediately. Order. There is no need to go back over that old ground. There was a dispute over the exact wording of the question asked, and that's why I've invited the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to repeat it. So then we can get an answer to the question the Honourable Leader of the Opposition intended. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Won't the government and therefore the New Zealand taxpayers be net losers if the returns to the Crown from SOEs sold are worth more than the money that he would save from not having to raise that money from bonds?
That was a somewhat different question, but still the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, possibly but not necessarily. And the answer to that is because if that was always going to be the case, then arguably that might be the situation, although having a mixed ownership model may in fact allow the new entity to generate even more returns. That's not necessarily the case. Mr Speaker, what I can say is maybe I can present to the member an example of where buying an SOE doesn't actually yield a terribly good return for the New Zealand government. That's called Kiwi Rail.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, was the percentage dividend return from SOEs earmarked for sale higher or lower than the 10-year bond rate last year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I don't have that to hand, but the point is not really what it was. The point is what are the likely returns, if one wants to go down this argument, vis-à-vis the government bond rate over the next 10 years. We're not aware of those returns at this point.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, is he aware that the total return to the Crown of state-owned enterprises that are earmarked for sell-down has been double or treble the dividend return over the last 5 years?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I said, that's not the average net dividends, which is what the Crown actually receives. That's actually off a benchmark Treasury analysis of their assets. And as I said in my primary question, or answer to his primary question, the Treasury advises that those calculations are not particularly robust and in fact are potentially misleading.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Does he propose to restrict the sale of shares in those SOEs to his so-called mum and dad investors, or will a substantial number of those shares ultimately find their way into the hands of foreign investors with dividends being sent out of the country?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, the government's taking advice on how to prioritise New Zealand mums and dads. I think it's worth remembering that, of course, at all times the government will hold a majority ownership because we won't go below 51%. I think it's also worth remembering, if one goes and has a look at Contact Energy as a good example, where the New Zealand mums and dads who bought those shares, while they may have individually changed hands, as Patrick Smelly pointed out, it's actually misleading to say that they don't continue to hold them. In fact, as he wrote in a piece he did for about a year ago, a loyal bunch contact Kiwi shareholders. In fact, actually, the register shows a very wide range ownership by Kiwi mums and dads.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
In respect of Contact Energy that the Prime Minister has just mentioned, that was privatised by a former national government, isn't it correct that now more than $100 million a year go out of this country and into the pockets of foreign investors out of assets that were once owned and benefited from by all New Zealanders?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, that might be the case. But Mr Speaker, I'd also point out that given New Zealand has one of the highest levels of external liability as a percentage of GDP, our borrowing and therefore bond returns would go overseas as well.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, is he aware of and does he accept the findings of energy expert Molly Mellish that the sale of energy companies overseas to private shareholders and pressures from them to increase profits have resulted in the prices... Mr Speaker, point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I'm sure the Prime Minister wants to hear the question. If his colleagues stop barracking, they might do that.
Order. Order.
You're a joke.
Order. Now, Both members will stand... Well, no, I won't ask that because I think it's somewhat difficult for the Shadow Leader of the House to stand at the moment to apologise. But I say to both the Leader and the Shadow Leader of the House, I'm on my feet and the Honourable Simon Power will respect that, and the Leader of the House will not interject during a point of order, and neither will the Shadow Leader of the House. And unless I got that as the member... Someone interjected on my left here. I apologise to the member... was the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. I apologise to the Honourable Member. I obviously got that wrong. But both members will cease interjecting. And, OK, we've had a bit of fun out of it now, but we'll come back to order. While the Prime Minister has been answering questions, there have been quite loud interjections from the opposition, and I've not stopped them. Maybe I should have. But I think if I were to come down on the government through interjecting during that question, it would have been unfair of me. But I would ask members to be a little reasonable about the level of interjection. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, he'd better start his question again, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Does he accept the findings of energy expert Molly Mellish that the sale of energy companies to private shareholders and pressure from those shareholders to increase profits has resulted in the prices of the shareholder-owned companies in New Zealand for electricity to Kiwi consumers going up much faster than prices for the SOEs?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no. And I'd point out that the dividend return for the 9 years that Labor was in office for the three SOEs that are in the energy sector, Genesis, Mighty River Power and Meridian, was 72%. So, Mr Speaker, if there was gouging happening, it was happening actually under a government-owned company.
Question number 3, David Bennett.